Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're logging on from in the world, and welcome to this latest Infrastructure Intelligence live webinar in association with BECG. And today we're discussing, certainly a fortnight ago, what was an extremely topical issue, and it's still, of course, a topical issue now, and that is COP26. We had a webinar in the run-up to COP26 when we had a conversation and a discussion about what people thought the event might bring. And this event is going to basically review a little bit what happened at COP and also crucially what it means for the construction and infrastructure sector in the company of what I'd like to think is an expert panel, all of whom were at COP26, including me. My name's Andy Walker. I'm your chairman for this webinar, your moderator, if you like. But I bow down to the knowledge of all of my fellow panelists here, who I know have got a lot to say about what happened at COP and where it might lead our industry in the future. As I say, we've got a really good panel this morning, comprising a number of key people from our industry. We've got Claire Lavelle from Arup, we've got Denise Bauer from Mott MacDonald, we've got Tom Bradley from Cavendish Advocacy, we've got Zoe Hazeman from Jacobs, and also Joanna Price from ACOM. They'll all get an introduction separately in a moment, but we're going to kick off with our first panelist just to offer some thoughts on COP and what we think it might mean. And our first panelist is Claire Lavelle, who is the Scotland energy leader for Arup. In fact, she leads Arup's energy consulting business in the north, which includes Scotland, Northern Ireland, and northeast of England. She's a mechanical engineer by training and a career in the energy industry who began in offshore renewables. So I think it's fair to say that she is especially passionate about the innovation of energy technologies in achieving net zero. Anyway, Claire, the floor is yours.
Great. No, thanks, Andy, for that great introduction. And I know we've got a diverse range of panelists today covering a broad range of topics. So I wanted to talk specifically about the energy system's role in contributing to decarbonisation and how energy was on the agenda at COP. So globally, about 3/4 of our greenhouse gas emissions come from our energy system. So that's largely the energy that we're supplying to buildings, transport, and industry. And the vast majority of that energy is supplied by fossil fuels. So our energy system is the powerhouse that bakes in emissions to our wider economy, and in particular, the embodied carbon in the materials that we use to construct our infrastructure. So tackling energy is critical to achieving net zero and decarbonising the built environment. So I thought I might lead with the bad news, and that is that the global transition of our energy system is slow. So in 2000, 86% of our energy came from fossil fuels. By 2019, it was 84%. So we're moving the dial at a painfully slow rate, and not a rate that's compatible with our commitments to 1.5 degrees. So energy matters, and there's a lot to be concerned about because the growth in demand for energy is matching our great efforts in decarbonising our energy system. But for the good news, the Glasgow Pact took a significant step forward in our global commitments to decarbonisation. So before the Paris Agreement in 2015, we were on course for 4 degrees of warming. Paris brought it down to a bit over 3.5 degrees. And with all the emission pledges we now have for 2030, we're on track for 2.4 degrees if countries do what they've promised. It's not yet enough, but it's a step in the right direction. So it was incredibly meaningful for me that COP was hosted in my home nation of Scotland. And that's because Scotland have demonstrated that within a generation, our energy system can be transformed. So when I started my career a couple of decades ago, less than 10% of our electricity was supplied by renewables. It's now over 97%. We've still got a mountain to climb as we need to tackle emissions from heat transport and industry, which make up 3/4 of our energy demand. but we've demonstrated that transition can technically be achieved and is economically sustainable. If we look to the Climate Action Tracker, which assesses nations' targets, policies and actions towards achieving 1.5 degrees, it hasn't identified any global nations that are 1.5 degrees compatible, and only 8 nations that are almost sufficient, the UK being one of those. The role of early adopter net zero economies like Scotland, like the UK, is critical to demonstrating the economic viability of delivering on net zero. So for me, some headlines from the energy sector at COP. Well, number one was the global consensus is that hydrogen is key to achieving net zero. It could supply 1/4 of the world's energy demands by 2050. I attended Energy Day in the Blue Zone, and hydrogen featured strongly and as a key part of the policy of an increasingly large number of nations. And the reason for the interest in hydrogen is because of net zero and the need to decarbonize our whole energy system, even the stuff that's really difficult to do with clean energy, clean electricity. So hydrogen's got the potential to play a role in a range of applications where electricity struggles, but it's also about having a more resilient system. So we've never had a single vector energy system, just electricity. The resilience of our system has relied on diversity of fusing molecules and electrons. And so hydrogen has the potential to complement increasing electrification by creating that resilient system. There's consensus now that's the case, and a focus on how we scale up supply and demand of hydrogen through policy framework. Number two for me was finance is key. And in the short term, there's a really important role that governments need to play in creating a route to market that can leverage private sector funding. So that route to market allows development and delivery of a pipeline that can allow technology to go on a cost reduction pathway as it matures. That means that public sector funding plays an increasingly smaller role in delivering a market in the future, but we won't get there without consistent and well-designed funding frameworks for the production and demand of low carbon solutions. So leading on to that, subsidy is a means to an end. What we really need to do is reach that tipping point where low carbon solutions no longer need support and subsidy, to the point where they're the cheapest and most cost-effective solution. So we're already seeing that happening with onshore wind and solar versus coal. And at COP26, the breakthrough agenda saw more than 40 nations committing to aligning standards, coordinating investments to speed up progress towards that tipping point. The first 5 areas of focus are clean electricity, electric vehicles, green steel, hydrogen, and sustainable farming, with an ambition to reach tipping points by 2030. The overwhelming focus has been on carbon, but methane is an incredibly pernicious greenhouse gas, and the commitments to methane reductions, and in particular fugitive emissions from our oil and gas production, are critical to ensuring that carbon capture and storage and blue hydrogen are genuinely sustainable solutions. And it's going to be absolutely critical that full life cycle assessments are undertaken, strict standards implemented to ensure that the supply chain can deliver projects that deliver effective greenhouse gas reductions. And then finally, phasing down coal or phasing out coal. Disappointment aside at the last minute watering down of wording, what's clear is that the end of the fossil fuel era is in our sights. So on a related note, my own COP highlight was a commitment closer to home. So an announcement made from Arup that we would commit to whole life cycle carbon assessments for all buildings, and that the focus of our energy business will be entirely on low carbon solutions and the energy transition. We've already committed to net zero emissions across our operations by 2030, but we recognise the much wider potential for positive impact that we can contribute from the advice we provide our clients. And I talked about at the start that none of us are there yet in terms of living net zero. I think that's true at a personal level, at a corporate level, at a national level, or globally. We're not yet on track to achieving 1.5 degrees, but the Glasgow Pact has kept that hope alive. So Andy, I'll hand back to you there.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Claire, and for pointing out a number of issues. I think particularly highlighting the fact that although there's some moves in the right direction, we're still not at 1.5 yet. and there's work that needs to be done. I think interesting as well, you mentioned the issue of hydrogen, which to me still seems to, when we receive material stuff, articles at Infrastructure Intelligence, the hydrogen issue still seems to be, there's more information coming out on it, but it still seems to be a little bit out of the ordinary. It's nowhere near mainstream yet. And you just think, how do we get from where we are now to where we need to be going forward? I mean, it's obviously a massive challenge, and obviously it's one of the things that we're discussing today. We won't solve it today, or maybe we will. But anyway, I think it's really interesting to hear where things are heading in that particular direction. For now, thanks very much. We'll obviously return to some of your insights in the discussion. Our next panelist is Denise Bauer, OBE, the Group External Engagement Director from Mott MacDonald, where she has responsibility, amongst many responsibilities, for client and partner relationships, and also for Mott MacDonald's corporate commitments on global issues. She also provides board-level oversight for Mott MacDonald's response to the climate emergency across the business. So I can't think of anyone equally as well qualified as the rest of our panel to speak on this issue today. So Denise, over to you.
Thanks very much, Andy. Delighted to join you for this discussion today. Look, I think it'd be really surprising, wouldn't it, if I tried to argue that COP26 was a resounding success. But I think it'd also be a bit too glib to say that it was a massive failure. So you were asking us for some, sort of scores on the doors earlier, and I think we all sort of broadly agree the direction of travel was positive. So whilst in the end, I think there was some phasing down, as we've just heard from Claire, rather than some phasing out, even in the narrow terms of the intergovernmental negotiations, there was some progress made too. So against that backdrop, I suppose, we'll have to see what countries come back with next year in terms of their revised nationally determined contributions. But the way that they have committed to doing so does at least create a pressure point for future change and further change to the extent of which, again, we were just hearing from Claire. So I think one of the things that I thought was regrettable was that the most vulnerable, smaller and island nations felt they were shortchanged in Glasgow. But I do think that the much greater focus on adaptation and resilience shows that some of their concerns are rising up the agenda. And I suppose for me, over the sort of fortnight in Glasgow that I spent, trying to help the race to resilience catch up with the race to zero was certainly a big focus of energy and efforts from myself and our team. I think, as Claire's already mentioned, the language hammered out on the future of coal didn't go far enough, but already it is clear that financial institutions have received the signal loud and clear, and they're joining companies like us at Mott MacDonald in signing up to the Powering Past Coal Alliance and really sort of driving the change that I think we all believe is really needed. In fact, one of the most positive aspects of COP26 was the growing engagement of actors other than national government in driving forward the climate transition and in preparing the world for the changing climate. I thought city leaders, whether elected or appointed, financiers, businesses, were all amongst those to have a noticeably sort of stepped up responsibility in terms of personal and corporate leadership roles in this space. And I did find that quite positive. So highlights from our perspective included being able to share work we've been doing with cities all over the world, including Bangkok, to collect, analyse and use data in order to prepare better for flood events and to respond more effectively to them in real time, particularly important when flooding's increasing. We can have and should quite rightly have a high degree of focus on energy efficient buildings, decarbonising some of the assets, the new assets that will go onto the system. But if they all get washed away in floods or they can't operate because the temperature's too high, some of those efforts will have been wasted. Discussing our new physical climate risk assessment methodology, which we created as part of the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, was also a highlight for me because it will help investors and asset owners for the first time improve the resilience of infrastructure and the built environment against the physical impacts of climate change by making it feasible to do an assessment of those physical impacts of climate change at asset level. And I also really thought that emphasising the role that engineers can play in designing in climate resilience and reduce carbon emissions in all aspects of future infrastructure in the built environment, right from the start of the process, and the dramatic impact that can have was really positive too. So I did come away from Glasgow a little bit tired, I guess, as most others who spent a fortnight there, but feeling upbeat about the role that we as engineers and individuals can and must play in the coming years in limiting the damage to our climate and delivering a fair, inclusive and just transition. And there are many reasons for optimism. However, I think it's also been surprising and to an extent disappointing how quickly COP26 has faded from the political agenda, certainly in the UK and in other nations as well. It feels a little bit like Whitehall, Westminster and the media have all shifted focus, and that the COP26 box has been ticked and we're now focusing on other things. So I think another job for all of us to do is keep the momentum up, carry on making our individual contributions and continue to transform our businesses to be fit for the new world. That's the journey we're on today, and in time I believe that COP26 will be seen as an important milestone along the way, Andy.
Thanks very much in that for those initial comments, Denise. And I think the last point you made about COP26 kind of fading from kind of the national news agenda, there's a certain inevitability about that. And I have to blame my fellow journalists for basically moving on to the next issue. But of course, there isn't any more important issue than this particular issue. But I think there was something else that you said as well when you made your contribution just then. And that's when you said one of the features of COP26 being the growing engagement of other actors apart from national leaders. And I think certainly one of the things I saw when I was at COP was not only the city leaders that you mentioned, and again, a big shout out to our sector as well, by the way, who were all over COP, quite rightly, in my opinion. So I think that was a positive. But also there were a lot of young people, both around the fringe and even in the rarefied atmosphere of the blue zone, having their say as well. And I think that generation in particular, which of course is the future generation for our sector, for every sector, will not allow world leaders to actually forget about this issue. And woe betide any world leader that actually thinks that they can get away with just putting it on the back burner and forgetting about it. I just don't think that will happen. And hopefully, we'll see some more on that as well. And I know when Joanna speaks later, I think she'll have something to say about that kind of sort of issue. Amongst the youth as well, I think, hopefully. Anyway, we must move on. Our next panelist is Tom Bradley, who is an associate director at Cavendish Advocacy. They are specialists in government relations, in communications, work as part of the BECG group as well. Tom has wide experience in public affairs and also political campaigns. And there was obviously a lot of politics on the table at COP across the board. And so as our resident political analyst on the panel, Tom, you've got the plum job of maybe giving your observations on some of those developments at COP, what this might mean going forward and how it might influence our industry, what happens politically as a result of the 2 weeks up in Glasgow. So over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks to everyone for joining this morning. I think one of the things that was particularly interesting around COP, and to a certain extent, a failure of expectation management from the UK government beforehand, was actually the balance between the focus on global agreements and what's going on here in the UK. And all this talk about having a Glasgow Pact or new Glasgow Accord, whatever they wanted to call it beforehand, and then having to sort of furiously row back on that. I'm sure there are some red faces across Westminster and Whitehall there. I think, though, one of the things, if I just sort of look at the global stage, first of all, one of the things that we've seen that was slightly different at this COP compared to previous COPs is obviously we didn't necessarily get that overarching agreement, and we didn't get buy-in from some of the big polluters to the extent that we might have liked, the likes of China and obviously some rollbacks from India and Russia and Saudi Arabia and others. But actually, one of the things that I think was a success that perhaps wasn't as sort of widely publicized was the smaller deals that were done between the different nation states, and actually the impact that they will have on global warming and on the climate more generally. I think we shouldn't underestimate that impact. And I think that's a success in terms of UK diplomacy and that kind of having to shift in tactics away from trying to cajole the big players to suddenly realizing, okay, yeah, we need a different plan here. But I think from my perspective, one of the things that I found particularly enlightening actually was the extent to which UK political actors, politicians, think tanks, industry, civil society, local government, the list goes on, the extent to which actually we all sort of got together and adopted COP as our own. And, you know, it's a slightly weird conference in that it's run by the UN and there's all sorts of people there from national governments and whatnot. But actually, there was a real UK presence there, and we really owned that conference. And a lot of the conversations that I was involved with weren't necessarily focused on those UN, those international agreements, but actually on the work that's going on here in the UK, and how we can work together to address climate change, how we can help to decarbonise, and how we can get to net zero. And I think as some of the other speakers have said already this morning, you know, the breadth of some of those organisations there actually was absolutely staggering. And I think for me, it's sort of been a real mark in the sand that, yes, this is a key political issue. It's not going away. It's really for the first time brought together all of those different organisations and really emphasised the consensus now that there is across the board here in the UK that there is climate change, it is man-made, something needs to be done, and actually that everyone is working together to this 2050 or earlier in some cases goal. And I think, you know, there were some very grown-up conversations there about actually how do we make that happen. It wasn't so much talking about the target anymore and my target's better than yours or whatever it might be, but actually how do we get there? There was certainly no lack of ambition, no lack of ideas in the fringe events that I attended, whether that was from industry or whether that was from politicians. So I think the message that's going back to Westminster and Whitehall is that the UK is ready to deliver on net zero. There is consensus. People want it to happen. We've got the ideas, we've got the technology, we've got the know-how, and actually the UK can be a world leader in decarbonisation and net zero. It's now about making sure that the political frameworks, the regulatory frameworks, the policy frameworks, that those are in place to help unlock some of these technologies and actually to make it happen. And that if that is the case, and when that's the case, that actually we've got a really bright future ahead of us, not just in terms of decarbonising here in the UK, but in terms of growing that green economy, reskilling the workforce, creating new jobs, building new sectors. And, you know, our sector, the infrastructure sector, is absolutely front and centre of that. If we look at decarbonising transport, decarbonising heat, decarbonising construction, those are all fundamental, and those, you know, as I said, there are the skills and the ideas here in the UK, and those are where we can be a global leader. So I'm really looking forward to continuing those conversations. And I think it's been said before, it's really important that we as a sector don't sort of say, right, that's COP done, job done, move on to the next thing. That actually we continue to build on that, and that we realise the potential that was shown in Glasgow.
Thanks very much, Tom, for those remarks. I thought it was interesting as well that you mentioned about the fact that there was a strong message going back to Westminster and Whitehall that the UK wants this, is ready to deliver. I think a lot of people have a lot of responsibility to keep that message, and it goes back to the point that was raised earlier about keeping it in the public headlines. I think that's important. But I also think as well, and this struck me, particularly when I think about the presence of some of the city leaders that were there, because if we can be a little bit parochial for a second and look at it from a UK perspective, there are a number of key political kind of drivers that are going on at the minute across the board, particularly including things like levelling up. And there's a lot of talk in our industry sector about social value. I think net zero and sustainability is absolutely inextricably linked to all of that. And I'd like to see a little bit more joining up being done, because I don't necessarily think that it's actually being done in the right way at the moment. And I think our industry as well has probably got a role in that area to actually nudge the politicians, to take a more joined up approach. One of the things that I really like about our sector and about engineers in particular is that they're quite good at joining things up. They almost can't look at anything without looking at how it interrelates with other stuff. For me, that's the future. That's the way you need to look at things. Unfortunately, politicians can be, shall we say, better choose my words carefully here, a little bit short-sighted and a little bit myopic sometimes. And obviously, we know they're slaves to the political timetable as well, and already they're thinking about what they need to do to get elected. But anyway, just some thoughts there from me. I think we'll explore some of that later on, because obviously the politicians have a key role to play in all of this and making net zero happen. Anyway, our fourth panelist is Zoe Hazeman, who's the Vice President for Global Sustainability at Jacobs. She's responsible there, has a job title in FIRS, for the global sustainability strategy and implementation and integration of ESG-related business risks and opportunities for her organisation. I had the pleasure of speaking with Zoe at COP, and we had a I thought was an interesting conversation. Anyway, I don't know what she thought, but so I'm really looking forward to Zoe's insights on what she thought of COP and some of the wider issues going forward. So Zoe, over to you.
Thanks, Andy. Yes, I agree. It was very interesting indeed. And I was a bit tired. I think you got me on the last day before I went home. But yes, and like the colleagues and fellow panelists here, it was a lot of fun, really good work, but pretty tiring as well by the end of it. So COP26, from my perspective, I think it did meet expectations. But I think my expectations were pretty well managed going into it, as I'm sure all of yours were as well. And despite all the mounting pressure in the run-up to COP26 that we saw across all the media, that this was our last big chance to save us from the climate crisis, the reality was, and is, there isn't a silver bullet for this. It's going to be years and years of ongoing negotiation and pushing and hard work. But what COP26 did do a really good job of was adding further pressure on all of those convening world leaders and countries to create that alignment and progress in some really important areas as well. So, and the other speakers have mentioned it already, deforestation, the methane emissions reduction, that financial support, that $130 trillion of investment money coming forward. Really great, strong theme of nature protection and regeneration throughout all of the discussions across COP26, which was brilliant to see that alignment with nature. And as you mentioned, Andy, just sort of like, you can't see decarbonisation in a silo. It has to be a lot more holistic than that. So that was great. Phasing down on fossil fuels, it wasn't as good as we hoped for, but it's there in the pact, which is good. And then really important, the ramp up of NDCs by countries this year. And so bringing that sort of like that next level of ambition around country targets of decarbonisation and bringing that sooner rather than further out, which is good as well. So I don't want to sound cynical because I am really hopeful, but I think words are cheap and it's very easy to make these big headlines and splashes and come up with these commitments. But we know that there's not always the follow through, unfortunately. So I think with this, with these commitments, time will tell. whether all of the, whether these areas will actually be a success and actually deliver the goods. Will we deliver on those commitments and ambitions? From a business perspective, I think there was a lot more clarity, including for our sector coming out of COP26. Net zero decarbonisation is unequivocally the direction of travel for all members of industry, society. And I think this level of alignment, consistency around what is needed, as well as the urgency, has never ever been clearer. So just that sort of sense of everybody there, focused and ready to act in this area. COP26 saw launches of some really important new frameworks and standards, which are really going to help further accelerate organisations with that greater alignment again. So for example, the new net zero corporate standard by the Science Based Target Initiative that was announced just before COP26, but also the announcement of the UK Treasury that all UK listed companies are going to be required to publish net zero plans by 2023. All really good progress and really welcome. For our sector specifically, the UK Green Buildings Council published its net zero whole life carbon roadmap for the UK built environment, which was a big cross-industry collaboration effort, and that really details out some of the necessary actions that government and industry are going to need to make to achieve net zero across our sector, including it also sets out carbon budgets and reduction trajectories as well. So a really good piece of work there to help that cross-industry organisational and collaborational piece. I think the loudest message from COP26 for me was around implementation and that need to take action now. I mean, this was echoed from the streets of Glasgow. We talked about sort of like how big the event, the scale of the event physically. Walk from the city centre over to the different, the blue zone, green zone, and some of the business fringe events. And the youth, the activists, they were there and they were loud and they were clear on the streets, and that now action needs to be now. And that spread all the way through, right from the opening day, the speeches from the world leaders on the opening day, and across every event that I participated in and attended. It was all implementation, action needs to happen now. So I think that's what comes next, and we still need to better understand how that's going to happen. The achievability and affordability of all these commitments, and really ultimately close that gap between the ambition and the words, and now getting it delivered. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks very much, Zoe. And again, that urgency, I think that you talked about there was, that it's got to be that really. The time, loads of people said it, the time for talking, it is long gone really. And I think, that's why, the disappointment that was expressed earlier about maybe it not being in the headlines enough. I think, I think we can actually play a role in raising the profile of net zero, particularly when you consider that nothing is going to get designed, nothing is going to get built, nothing is going to get planned without being net zero compliant, or it shouldn't be. Anyway, I heard yesterday as well that still, though, I think there's still, it might be less than 50% of clients are asking for projects and designs to be net zero compliant. They're actually asking for that, which isn't a good sign. So I think that it just shows you that there still needs to be some education as far as that's concerned, going forward. But again, I think our sector, our industry is actually quite well positioned to actually take that message, raise the profile of that message really. Anyway, we can discuss a little bit more about that when we've heard from our final panelist, who is Joanna Price, who is a senior structural engineer at AICOM. She, like all of our panel, also took part in COP26 and was on one of the official panels that discussed using the Sustainable Development Goals, first mentioned for those today, and we'll probably come back to those as well later on, using the Sustainable Development Goals to tackle the climate emergency. Anyway, Joanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction. And I have to start with I'm very happy that I heard some of you mention the importance of having engineer-led solutions. and how important it is to engage with the younger generations to tackle the climate emergency. And actually, as a young engineer, I think probably I have quite a lot to say to this. So we have to discuss after the introductions and elaborate a bit more on this. Yeah, as Andy said, yes, I had the privilege to contribute to take part in a panel discussion in the Green Zone as a representative for the Women's Engineering Society Climate Emergency Group, which was absolutely fantastic. And for me, the COP had two sides to it. Obviously, the most important and crucial side were the intergovernmental negotiations in the Blue Zone, for which hopefully we've also, everyone on sort of listening in has been following the news closely over the past sort of those 2.5 weeks. But the other, to me at least, brighter side of the event was actually the knowledge sharing platform that the COP offers. And this is what I saw in the Green Zone. The energy there was absolutely electrifying. Everyone I met and everyone I spoke to was really passionate about making a difference and was actively working towards bettering their fields, their local communities, or even just raising awareness for the issues that their countries are facing, both in tackling but also in responding to climate change. And it was almost as if COP was sort of formed of two individual conferences sort of running in parallel. And what I saw in the Green Zone was more like a willingness to connect, willingness to form new relationships and to collaborate to create resilient and innovative solutions to tackling and responding to the climate emergency, really. And actually, to me, this was really, really positive, and it was really energizing, because the reality is that the only way we can tackle the climate emergency is by working together, by working across different sectors, across different geographies, and develop and apply holistic solutions. And yes, while it's true that yeah, the governments are moving in the right directions, we all know that they're doing this frustratingly slowly, and we keep falling short of the ambitious actions that we so desperately need. But this actually makes it even more critical for us as a private sector and our professional institutions and non-governmental organizations to actually act and work together to develop the necessary systems needed so desperately to decarbonize, well, from my perspective, the construction industry, but also all industries, really. That's it from me.
Thanks very much, Joanna. And I think the point that you made there about passion and a willingness to actually take things forward, I think is really important, because we won't get anywhere without that. And a number of our panelists have mentioned, you know, the stuff that was happening around COP as well, particularly, you know, some of the, you know, the activities of some of the young people as well, who were obviously there to demonstrate and to talk about, you know, what they wanted to see going forward. I think that's really important to make that point. We've now got our usual panel discussion, and I've got various questions that I want to put to the panel. But the one I want to start with is probably quite a big kind of issue as well, and that is one of the big things that was discussed at COP26 was the need for those, shall we say, more richer nations to actually do the right thing, and also ultimately to come up with finance to enable those other nations to actually be able to address the issues and also to achieve net zero. Do we think there was enough done in that area? And what do you think the prospects are for some of the richer nations to actually put the money in that's actually needed? And if I can just pose that question first of all to Denise.
Thanks very much, Andy. I think, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we were focusing quite a lot on the resilience agenda as much as the decarbonisation agenda. And in that space, just like some other colleagues on the call, we're part of the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, because I think the work that coalitions are doing, and Joanna was just making the point about groups coming together, I think is where you can be much more effective in channeling the finances in different ways from the ways that they've maybe gone historically. So I think it does need, engineers coming together with asset owners, with investors, with insurers. We've not mentioned the role of the insurance industry yet today, and others, to make sure that we're speaking the same language, we understand and conceive of the problems in a sort of common language way, and then develop those sort of bankable investment programs, whether they are for decarbonisation or they are adaptation and resilience, so that the funds can be channeled effectively. And then I think that unblocks the kind of, from the strategic to the implementation level, which is where things often get bogged down. So that for us was an absolutely key issue. And I think also there has to be support within the nations that need the funds to make their projects more bankable. So that sort of bottom-up approach as well, which is again where sort of more technical advisors, engineers, etc., can really help to make sure that the capacity and capability that's not always in those regions can be bolstered effectively. So I don't think we really know for sure how bankable the Global South is, but we can't wait long to find out. And while that massive private capital is trying to find a home, I think we all need to be working together to help it find that home.
Thanks, Denise. Claire, what's your view on that? The prospects for that finance to be available and the difference to be made?
Yeah, and I think maybe Andy would even broaden it out a little. I do think there is a lot of focus. That this just transition, where we're kind of seeking, how do we decarbonize our economy? How do we create, maximum economic opportunity and create jobs in a supply chain around that, and that kind of build back better focus. And I think some of the rhetoric around that is around, that we've got these developing nations. They kind of help us get to these tipping points where things become viable, and actually it's a kind of financing in the other nations of the world. And and there's a lot of gains for those early movers, so those people that are kind of first adopters and build that supply chain. And I think there's a risk there that we're a bit parochial. We're kind of focusing on each economy building its own capability. And, I think what's really, quite exciting about some of these breakthrough agenda commitments is about actually how do we work together with all of the global nations, and actually collaborate in terms of how we bring technology forward. How do we make sure some of those developing nations are, not followers, not kind of adopters of mature technology and mature markets where it's a funding problem, but actually how do we get them right up front in terms of the creation of market and make that a more equitable transition. I think we're seeing some good signals there, and and some of those kind of internation agreements, I think, are speaking to that. But I absolutely think we need to go much further in that regard.
Thanks, Claire. Zoe, what's your view on that broader sort of international view?
Yeah, are we doing enough to support developing nations? No, the rich nations of the world are absolutely not doing enough. And there was a long-standing commitment that rich nations, the developed world, should be contributing 100 billion a year to support the developing nations against the impact of climate change that we're already seeing now. And that hasn't happened, and it's unlikely to happen. I think the best guess is that we might get there by 2023. So in terms of those commitments that have been made and lack of follow through, there's one example of where we're absolutely not doing what we need to the developed world is the creator. We're the ones that have caused the impacts of climate change. We should be helping out those developing nations from those to transition from those impacts.
Thanks for that, Tom. What's your view on that, on the likelihood? Obviously, there's a lot of realpolitik involved in all of this, as well as there always is, of those richer nations basically doing what needs to be done.
Yeah, I think it comes down to what the detail is in those agreements, Andy. And if you look at, there was one particular agreement struck during COP with South Africa and looking at actually restructuring their energy network there. And that brought together UK government, US government, industry, all together with the South African government. I thought actually that was a really good model of that sort of inter-stakeholder working, and actually where if something is explored in detail and it's open to it, then definitely it can work. Obviously, there's a lot of those deals that have got to be replicated for a lot of different countries. But I thought that was good progress in that sense. But I think just picking up on the point, I think it was Denise was making earlier, sorry, I can't remember who exactly it was, but about the financial institutions and actually how they will drive some of that change in terms of where investment is in investment funds, in pension funds, in insurance companies, etc. I think that will be one of the biggest fundamental shifts. And I think, you're seeing increasing pressure from the UK public and indeed from public across the developing nations that they want their investments to be green and to support green tech and that transition. And people are looking a bit more closely at actually the products that they're buying and what they're supporting. So I think a lot of that will come from consumer pressure on industry as well.
Thanks, Tom. Joanna, did you have any view on whether or not was there much conversation and discussion from your experience of COP, whether or not the larger nations are doing enough?
Yeah, I think probably like the short answer is no. But I think I also would like to maybe sort of tend to agree with Denise in some ways, that I think unlocking these opportunities for collaboration between nations and between institutions is actually possibly the way forward. From my point of view, I think creating these sort of opportunities to collaborate and pair Western or richer expertise and technologies with the local communities from the poorer countries could sort of, on specific initiatives, could sort of increase the demand and unlock funding opportunities.
Thanks, Joanna. Just turning to one of the questions in the chat box. There's a question raised about it's fair enough that that we're seeing increasing demands from clients for net zero new buildings, but what about existing stock, which we obviously know is a big challenge? And the question is, can the panelists provide any insight on how we can reduce the impact of existing stock, particularly building stock, in a viable way? And if I can kick that one off with Claire for her views on that.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd definitely, we will make very small impact in in our transition if we just keep our focus on new buildings. So it's really important that we improve standards, that we we design and construct in a way that we are we are baking in but better standards for the future. But we'll have a very slow transition if we don't tackle the existing building stock that we have. And certainly a combination of energy efficiency measures and and I think there's a lot of good work there in terms of looking at our macro housing stock, understanding, and building stock, understanding what the solutions are, how we fund and finance and deliver those. And obviously heating is a huge part of the solution here. And one of our single biggest contributors to carbon globally is heating and cooling our housing stock. And certainly within Scotland there's a target for 50% of domestic properties to be on low carbon heating solutions by 2030, and that's an absolutely major transition from where we are at the moment in terms of a housing stock that is largely fossil fuel based. So but both heat networks, electrification options, hydrogen, all offer some really interesting solutions, and actually we need a lot better understanding of what works best, you know, in terms of the whole system planning. What are the pathways for implementing those solutions are really areas that we've got to make much quicker progress on within the coming years.
Thanks, Claire. Denise, what's your view on that? Because clearly the existing building stock, you could argue that it should be a quick win, really, if we get it right. And yet, from where I'm sitting, there doesn't seem to be, particularly from a UK government perspective, enough of a drive in that particular area.
I think it goes back to my point about the disconnect from strategy to implementation, actually. And if you look at that on a city level, that came into a really sharp focus during COP. A lot of my conversations, as I said, were with city leaders who were left kind of scratching their heads at times around how you channel the money effectively into bringing about the sort of transformation that Claire was just describing. So we you know, there's a will there to make the change, but how you actually channel the funds. So I think there were announcements during COP about coming together, you know, cities coming together to create platforms for the funds to be channeled. But then you still, if you come at that from the other end, if you know somebody wants to come to your house, Andy, and you have no choice about it, change your windows, insulate your loft, which is full of old books, and you know, change your heat source, I think you, like the rest of us around this table, might expect to be able to have a voice in that. So I think actually one of the other positive conversations, which just widens out from the point raised in the chat, is around 15-minute neighbourhoods. And if you think about a neighbourhood and a community input to its transformation, and that's not just in the housing stock and the other infill, the buildings where people go, you know, where people work and so on, but about how the nodes people are travelling to are organised. What's a high street got on it? Where's the produce coming from for that high street? Where's its, you know, where's the sort of culture of that community being represented? And you think about active travel modes as well, moving people, walking, cycling, etc., which is the sort of 15-minute neighbourhood philosophy. You start to create some possibilities there which might not exist otherwise. So sorry, it was a bit of a long-winded response, but I think it's a really, really nuanced and complex space, this whole transformation. It's easy to talk about in theory, insulation, changing double glazing, etc. You know, but in practice, I think you've got to see it as part of that interconnected system of the heating, the travelling, and all the other systems coming together.
Well, again, it's that joined up piece again, isn't it? Which we sometimes don't appear to be that great at, even though the people in our industry understand what needs to be done, but obviously they are subject to policy and money as well, and finances. Zoe, watch.
Sorry, just to go back though to the point on capability and capacity to navigate that. It's the same whether it's a global north-south conversation or it's a within the UK decarbonising a city conversation. The capability and capacity in those institutions just really needs bolstering, and bolstering at pace. And that's where I think we don't talk enough about how to go about doing that and then manage the risks associated with the transition effectively. Sorry, Andy.
No, that's fine, because I think you've raised something there that I want to move on to anyway. And I want to get Zoe's views on this first, because that whole capacity piece, I think, is really important. And it also, I think, as well, speaks to the wider issue of whether it doesn't matter what you call it, it's a green transition, a Green New Deal, whatever it is, having much more sustainable business in the UK, because that's where the future is. It would appear to me. How do we encourage that, and how do we get to achieving some of those issues that Denise just spoke about? I don't know whether you have a view on that, Zoe, in particular, maybe referencing back to dealing with existing stock, but looking at the wider view of, sort of green business as a whole.
Yeah, so I think a couple of points on that existing building stock areas that, completely great points raised already, so don't want to go over those, but I think the role that digital has to play in all of this is really important one, and I think in terms of building capacity, green skills, green jobs is going to be, we're going to need to build capacity in those areas for sure, but that's another area that digital and technology can help, not only with that efficiency piece with the existing building stock, but also providing some of that capacity as well, in line with, you know, increasing the jobs in sort of sustainable jobs and green jobs in this area as well. So I think that's one area. Also, I think we shouldn't underestimate the role that, you know, society and people have in all of this. So user behavior, you know, it's not going to have the big impact savings that some of the things we talked about, like electrification, it is going to, but, you know, it's a really critical point. And I think COP26 was one of the things that we didn't mention that was great to see, particularly in the UK, was how mainstream it all was in the papers, in the media, to the point where I had friends talking to me about it that, you know, never mentioned anything. You know, we haven't had those conversations before. So I think just that societal awareness and education was really good from COP, and that will, you know, that will translate through into user behaviours as well, which will help with that existing building stock and efficiencies there. One other thing, quick point to make as well, off the back of Denise's sort of cities and, you know, how do we get the financing? You know, yes, we've got these plans, we know what we should be doing, but how do you get the money from the institutions and actually make, you know, deliver on it? I listened to, at COP26, listened to the Bristol City Mayor. I forget his name now, but really great, you know, great speaker, really inspiring. And he was really focused on the need for investment ready plans, with the whole, like, we know what we need, we know where we need to get to, we know what that endpoint looks like, we know that there's money available. What we're lacking now is investment ready plans. So when the money comes to the table, we've got it lined up, we know how we want to spend that money, and we've done the thinking around the commercials and the whole life costings and everything else. So yeah, just a couple of points to add to the conversation there.
Thanks. So just coming straight off the back of that and addressing this one to Tom about, you know, we need projects that can be invested in, but also what's your view about the government's role in facilitating all of that? And also, is the government doing enough to actually create? I mean, it talks about build back greener, build back better. These are just buzz phrases on one level. What does it all mean on the ground? And are we going to create this green economy of the future that we all want to see?
I won't call you a skeptic, Andy. It's all right. Just on the existing housing stock very quickly, and I guess sort of more generally on that point. There's a lot of policy coming down the line actually on that in the next few months, next year or so. So you've got the off-gas grid regulations, you'll have the fossil fuel heating ban. So there's a lot of things coming down the line actually within the next 12 months where industry and consumer groups need to be having their say and need to be helping to influence and shape what that policy is coming down the line. I think the bit that's perhaps missing and proves difficult from a UK perspective is around energy efficiency and what still needs to be done on that. But it's worth bearing in mind that the UK has a significantly older housing stock than, well, most of Europe, most of the world. And a lot of those buildings are very difficult to treat, for want of a better phrase. If you think about sort of stone cottages or whatnot that have traditionally been heated by a coal fireplace and have thick stone walls, it's very difficult to make them more energy efficient. So when we're looking at what options, how we decarbonize heating and existing buildings, we need to make sure that we're looking at a range of different options that can work for all of those housing stocks that actually work for consumers, because I think one of the things that's often missing is how do consumers use heat? How do they want heat? So making sure that whatever solution we offer them, they actually want and it works for them. And also cost. And I think those points around consumer choice and cost are rapidly rising up the political agenda, and you're seeing more and more people beginning to ask questions to say, well, hang on a minute, that all sounds good, but what does it actually mean for the voter? And sorry, your other point was around facilitating and unlocking tech. Is that right?
Yeah, but basically, where I was coming at was basically there's a lot of talk about creating, sort of green business, that sort of green industrial revolution and all that kind of stuff. But I don't necessarily see you know, a lot of delivery on that. I'll come back to that, because one of the other things I want to kind of flag up is this thing about perception, reality, and what needs to be done. So there's a lot of talk about domestic energy and what that actually means. But again, I don't know about where you guys live, but where I live in County Durham, and I look around, people are still using gas boilers. That's normal. That's just what's happening. And it seems like a massive leap to get from that to the kind of stuff that we need to do, that is actually going to enable us to hit the net zero target, because it's almost like we're starting off with one hand tied behind our back as far as that's concerned. And that's not only because COP didn't agree to the 1.5%. So it's actually, starting from a negative as far as that's concerned. And I'm kind of being deliberately controversial on one level. But when you have a situation where, the vast majority of domestic heating is basically still fossil fuel, how are we going to get from where we are now to where we need to be? How is that going to happen? And as people who work in the industry and with some knowledge of energy as well, how can you sort of explain, how would you explain that this is actually possible and we can actually do it? And I'm going to start with Claire on that one, because it may be that we can learn some lessons from our friends north of the border on this.
Yeah, I think I kind of swing from two extremes on the role of consumers and the role of general public in change. And I watched actually the great BBC documentary on the Citizens Assembly, where there were 100 members of the public engaged in working with the Climate Change Committee and other organisations in terms of developing carbon policies, and it was a really really interesting to see that journey of the general public that maybe understand about climate change but just don't know a lot of the detail, the impacts that their current lifestyle have, the actions that they can make, and how we take people on that informed journey and make them enthused, engaged, and make them understand that they need to make lifestyle changes that are part of the change, is a huge part of the solution. Equally, I know from boring lots of my friends at dinner parties on what's the best low carbon heating solution from their home, a lot of people don't care and don't want to know. And my own gas boiler broke down this week, and what people really want is to be able to make quick, easy consumer choices, and to have someone come along and say, this is what you need, this is the price, I'm going to install it. It's going to, you've got confidence in the whole life cycle cost. You've got confidence that it's going to work and it's going to be easy to install. And so actually, we need to do a huge amount of work in making sure that whatever solution that we're bringing to people, whether it's hydrogen boilers, whether it's heat pumps, whether it's heat networks, we've got to create an industry that actually just makes that easy and deliverable, because people don't want to get engaged. And, maybe us engineers, we want to do the full calculation, assessment, life cycle cost. Most people just want to be able to make a quick and easy purchase and have someone tell them what's the right thing to do. And we just don't have a framework at the moment that makes those solutions, cost effective for people, accessible to people, and easy for people to acquire. And the person that came along and looked at my boiler told me, just buy a new gas boiler. That's the cheapest, easiest thing to do. And we need to move beyond that point, so that we're, because in 10 years, Scotland, 50% of our homes need to be on low carbon solutions. So, it's a huge acceleration in terms of where we are at the moment.
Thanks, Claire. Joanna, what's your view on this? The issue seems massive. How do we convince people that it's doable?
Honestly, I can't engage in the conversation without mentioning what, to me at least, is the elephant in the room. That is embodied carbon, and the embodied carbon footprint of the decisions we make whether we build new or whether we refurbish. And so it's kind of sort of interlinked with the last couple of questions and everything that everyone's sort of been mentioning. And it's something that is really missing in most discussions. It's missing in the current regulations for refurbishing or for new built houses and construction generally. But it's actually essential if we want to meet that net zero agenda. We won't be able to do it if we only focus on operational energy. Operational energy is incredibly important, but we need to think of the embodied carbon footprint, which is essentially the carbon emissions associated with making of the materials, making of the building, or whatever you're putting in your house. And to me, that is a really important aspect that we need to address, and we need new regulations for this. And if we create the carbon budget, and if we have the regulations in place, then that could also be an incentive for government and for private clients to invest in refurbishment more, because it's less carbon intensive from an embodied carbon perspective than it is to build new. Yeah, that's what I want to say. I can talk more about it, but I'm just conscious of time.
Thanks for that, Zoe. Your view on this, and then I'm going to ask a question about what the industry can do as well, because I think we can do something about this. But Zoe, just on this particular issue.
On the domestic, the challenge of domestic homes. Well, Claire, you're not alone with having boiler problems this week, because I also had one. And my plumber came along and I said, okay, it didn't break down, but what happens when it does? What are our options? Talk to me about, air source, heat pumps and all these different things. And he's like, oh, you'll have another gas boiler before you can do anything like that. He's like, your house won't be any good for that anyway, because it's not efficient enough. You need like really tightly insulated houses to make them efficient. He was like, yeah. And also you'd need loads of a whole boiler room kind of thing, and it was just really interesting from being in, from a technical perspective. I don't know what the answer is, Andy. That isn't something that I can address, but just from a user, a consumer, that's it's a mountain ahead of us in terms of what we need to do, where we need to get to. I don't know how we get there.
I think, you see, that's one of the things for me that sort of, brings this down to brass tacks, really, because it is about behaviour change on one level, but you've got to make things easier for people. You can't just point the finger and we can't just say mea culpa. At the end of the day, you can't freeze to death, particularly if you're looking at the weather forecast for the next week and a half. But, how do we actually do that on a wider scale? And the question I wanted to float to you from an industry perspective is, what can our industry, given its expertise, what can our industry do to influence the government to make changes now, not years into the future, now? What can we do? How can we impress the urgency of the situation? And I suppose it comes back to, in some ways, keeping the whole thing back in the headlines. And I'm going to start with Denise on that.
Oh gosh, I think one of the things we can do is go with solutions and stop talking about challenges and problems. And I'm saying that, and I'm completely agreeing with Zoe. We don't have the answer to the heating problem. So I think there's something around coming together even more effectively than we currently do to be bringing forward solutions. And it's not just in respect of changing heating systems in houses, is it? There are so many parallels with the electric vehicle conversation, and we could have bubbled out the same sort of conversation we've just had in relation to heating our houses with electric vehicles and with water. There are parts of the UK that are running out of water, which people still think of as wet, but they'll run out of water pretty quickly. And so you take all of those different topics and more, and we have to come up with some really clear, understandable by a intelligent 12-year-old, educated 12-year-old type language, not an engineering language, which goes back to one of my other points, and come forward with some solutions and maybe prioritize them, maybe help with that prioritization. Sometimes it might appear to government that we want everything to happen overnight, and that's to a government that's still battling with the after effects of COVID. We've come through Brexit, we've got these sort of other challenges going on. So I think being really clear with some workable solutions in plain English in a prioritised fashion sounds really easy, doesn't it? It's not, and that's why we've invested in, things like the Net Zero Industry Infrastructure Coalition, because we recognise that importance of coming together with practical solutions. I think the other thing we can do is emphasise the importance of education. So we talked about behaviour change. Behaviour change will only come about through education, and we could be doing more to educate, not scare people now about the future and about the impact that choices are having on their own future. I think, Joanna made a point earlier, young people want to be involved in this conversation. They want to make a difference. So let's do more to educate all of us about our choices and the effects they're having. Maybe stop selling paddling pools, because they're not a great idea, are they? You've got the plastic, you've got the production, you've got the use of water. And I'm just going to, there are a number of things, stop rinsing your plate before you put it in the dishwasher. So education in a really simple, basic way like that, but also education in that wider sense around the climate emergency. Because, one of the phrases ringing in my ears from COP was the climate emergency is a global emergency, but the impacts are local and personal. And we've heard two very personal stories of people reflecting on what to do with the boilers this week. And we sometimes forget that, don't we?
Absolutely, we do. And interesting what you said there about explaining things, in clear language, that a 12-year-old can understand, which brings me on to the political situation once more. Tom, do our politicians really get this? And are they willing to actually do what needs to be done? I asked a version of this question earlier on, but I think it does come down to the politicians to make a lot of this happen. Do they get it?
Yes, the short answer, I think so. I think, though, ultimately it comes back to the consumer. And if we think about Claire's example there of, a boiler or whatever is a distress purchase, it's not something that you sit down for X many months as a replacement and think about. It's, what works for my house? What can I get now? What's going to heat it in the way that I want it to warm up? What's going to work? And what can I afford to buy? And I think industry needs to put the consumer front and center in all of those solutions that it's putting forward. And I think too often the conversation's been about the technology as opposed to the consumer and what works for the consumer. So I think we need to have that shift. And I think politicians have shifted now into thinking about what does it mean for consumers? What does it mean for voters? Just going back to your point there around what can industry do to push government, I think it's anything that they can do to look at no regrets options. The government don't want to pick a winner. They don't want to do a repeat of the everyone swap your petrol car to a diesel car because isn't it better? Oh, whoops. Oh no, that was a terrible idea. And a lot of these technologies are still in their infancy. We don't necessarily know which ones are going to work long term, which ones are going to be a success, and there'll be different solutions for different areas, different solutions for different houses, different solutions for different people. So I think really it's about positioning the tech in the way of no regrets options. And one of the policy asks that I think is really successful on that is from the hydrogen industry and the boiler manufacturers in asking for hydrogen ready boilers. And they draw the example to when we had the switch over from analog TV to HD TV, and everyone got an HD ready TV. No one knew what it was. And then all of a sudden someone flicked a switch and your TV worked. It didn't really matter. So actually starting to do things like that to say, okay, we'll mandate a hydrogen ready boiler that can run on natural gas or hydrogen. That's a no regrets option. So I think the more things we can look at like that get ready, but don't necessarily have to pick a winner and force some of those difficult decisions, the better.
Thanks for that, Tom. I want to wind things up with a question to everybody, which is partly about COP, but also about the future, which is the whole point, I think, of the conversation as well. And it's a simple question, really. Why should we, be more optimistic about the future in terms of reaching net zero than maybe we were 2 weeks ago, notwithstanding the discussion we just had about boilers, notwithstanding that. So why should we be more optimistic about the future? And how do we as an industry influence that future positively? And I'm going to start off with Joanna with that question.
Brilliant question. I like to end on a positive note. Yes, so why should we be optimistic? Well, I think this from within the built environment for our sector, COP26 was incredible because we had a whole special day that was dedicated to the built environment, which was absolutely fantastic. The fact that this is now being talked about more, the fact that it exists in most of the NDCs, everyone sort of considers it as a key point when they talk about net zero. This is a big win. And then now we have the opportunity to build on this. In terms of going forwards, we know that unfortunately governments are moving slow, but we as a private sector are not. And I do think that we're already doing quite a lot, and then we're moving at a very fast pace. So there's great things ahead of us, I think. We're developing a lot of tools and methodologies which will help us to deliver our projects and deliver a more sort of carbon friendly buildings and infrastructure going forward. And even the fact that what you sort of mentioned at the beginning of the discussion, that what 50% of clients are interested in net zero, I see this as a positive thing. The fact that it's not regulated, it's not mandatory, but yet clients are already interested in moving towards net zero. This is a really, really positive thing. And I think this number is only going to be increasing. So us as a private sector being ready to actually deliver net zero is something that we're working on at the moment. And the last little bit we need is the regulation and having a standard so that one building can be called a net zero building and be given a stamp of that sort of net zero standard.
Thanks, Joanna. Zoe, causes for optimism.
Okay, so I think everybody is aligned on the vision. Everyone knows where we need to get to. The technology, the finance, all the conditions are primed, and we have the vocal youth who will keep us accountable to delivering on this. With all of those conditions and factors, we have to be able to do it.
Thanks very much for that. Tom, I know you're not here to answer for the politicians, but give us some causes for optimism about why they're going to do the right thing.
I think there's a real sense of partnership working, and coming back to what I said to start with about my reflections on COP, it's that civil society, industry, and politicians and regulators all working together. And I think the more we can do that, the better. And it's a really exciting time in terms of policy. There's a lot coming out over the next 12 months. So the more conversations we can have and the more we can work together to shape that, the better.
Thanks, Tom. Claire, your view on this?
Yeah, I think maybe just to build on Zoe's point a little bit, for me, it's the youth engagement and, actually how society's changing and how we're being challenged by a new generation coming through. And that for me was, this common theme through COP, engagement in the blue and green zone, getting the train from Edinburgh to Glasgow on the day of the youth protest and talking to some of the the young people that were going to kind of protest and challenge. I had the privilege of being able to take my 9-year-old daughter to the green zone to listen to the Youth Activists in Your Hands documentary presentation. A young girl, Sophie Mather, talking about impacts of climate change in her country in Canada. And what I really see from that is this generation of kids that are coming through, the graduates that we're seeing within our organisation that are saying, we absolutely accept that we have an issue. that there's no more debate or question that something has to be done, and people want solutions and they want to be part of the solution. And I think that, from our kind of jaded, it's too challenging, here's all the barriers, actually we're being pushed as an industry, we're being pushed as engineers, as policymakers about, forget all that, what is the solution? And that to me, I think, is the really exciting sea change that we're seeing in society.
Thanks, Claire, for that. Finally, Denise, why are you optimistic about the future? Because I know you are.
I am optimistic, yeah, naturally optimistic. So alignment is an absolutely key word here, isn't it? I think the degree of alignment, even in the recognition of the challenges that I sort of sensed, heard, saw in every sort of shape of the word, how it could be interpreted, it made me really, really positive. And I think we are more clear about the destination we're trying to get to together, being aligned, than we were previously. And for me, the kind of call to action is more around, to government from industry, who's the designated driver? So if we know where we're trying to get to, more people are on the bus, who's the designated driver in each country with responsibility for making sure that we get there?
Thanks very much for that, Denise. We spoke earlier, didn't we, about joining things up? And I think of all industries, I think we have and I said this before, a unique ability to actually do that. I mean, I'm optimistic about the future. I'm also slightly concerned about politicians using too many words, whether they can be understood by 12-year-olds or whoever, and not necessarily coming up with actions. Because I think in the recent period, we have seen some steps forward. There has been a growing recognition amongst many people in society, and especially amongst the youth, that we need change. There can be no more business as usual. And I think as an industry, we do have a duty to call it out when we see stuff happening that isn't right. And I hope that post-COP and also into the new year as well, our industry will be a little bit bolder in getting on the front foot in not just assisting government, but also strongly advising government about what they need to do to get things right going forward. Because I think, for me, that's one of the ways that our industry raises its profile as well, and is seen not just as a trusted advisor, if I can use that term, but also is actually seen as a key player in providing solutions that will ultimately change people's lives. Because on this issue, that's what we're talking about, not just changing, even saving people's lives. I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us today at the webinar. I'd like to thank everybody on the panel, to Denise, to Claire, to Tom, to Zoe, and to Joanna for your insights. Look out for the report when it's on our website later on. Also, and just a final plug for our final webinar of 2021, which takes place on the 17th of December, where we'll be looking at 2022 and what that might bring for our industry going forward. Always an interesting discussion. Do join us at 11 o'clock on Friday, the 17th of December. Apart from that, thanks very much to everyone for their inputs, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.